Hi everyone, it's Anna Chevalier here. Welcome to the seminar today and thanks for joining us. I have a few other people to thank too today. So our topic is very topical. It's driver inattention and distraction. It moves us nicely on from our last webinar, which was on the system that's been put in place in New South Wales that uses cameras to identify drivers who are using their mobile phones. So also a distraction related topic. I wanted to thank our presenters. We've got Professor Michael Regan from the University of New South Wales, and we have Nicole Downing from Transport and Main Roads in Queensland. And I'll be your facilitator today on behalf of the Australasian College of Road Safety, the New South Wales chapter. Next slide, please, Isabella. Also wanted to thank, before I move on, the members of the College's New South Wales chapter, their executive committee who assisted with organising and promoting the seminar, and ARB who provided this GoToWebinar platform for us to use and have done a lot of work promoting the seminar for us, and then Isabella, Jess and Susie from ARB who are providing support today to ensure that the webinar runs smoothly. Sorry, back one slide, Isabella, I jumped forward. It's my pleasure also to welcome Dr. Prasanna Prabhakaran, who is our New South Wales Chapter Vice Chair for the Australasian College of Road Safety, and I'm going to hand over to him and he will welcome you all today. Over to you, Prasanna.
Thanks, Anna. And on behalf of the College and the New South Wales Chapter, I'd like to welcome everyone, and particular thanks to our two guest speakers. Anna's mentioned that we've had over 100 registrants for this seminar today, and we're finding this webinar session, this platform to be quite successful in disseminating to our members the latest developments in road safety. We're always looking for ways to better service our membership, so if anyone has, that's on the line, if anyone has any hot topics that they'd like to present, or if they'd like to see a presentation on, please feel free to get in touch with your local chapter. Our New South Wales chapter email address, I'll put that in the chat box in a minute. For those of you who aren't members who have joined us today, the college has a practice of giving a 3-month complimentary membership for non-member attendees. If you're interested in that, please get in touch with our national office and mention that you attended this seminar today. If you have any other questions, please feel free to get in touch with either Duncan or myself. Duncan's the current chair of the New South Wales Chapter Committee, and we'd be happy to help you out. I'll keep it brief and I'll hand back to Anna, and a warm welcome to everyone.
Wonderful, thanks very much, Prasanna. As I said, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the seminar and to have these two very knowledgeable presenters with us today. So I'd like to introduce them. If you could go to the next slide, please. And the next one. Oh, I forgot my housekeeping. Okay, so the webinar is about 60 minutes long. We have a question time at the end, which will be around 10 minutes. The webinar will be recorded, and providing the recording goes well, the recording and a copy of the PDF version of the slides will be emailed out to you all by the Australasian College of Road Safety head office. Next slide, please. If you'd like to ask a question, so all the people who are watching are on mute. If you'd like to ask a question, over in that right-hand side panel, there's a drop-down box in grey that says questions. If you click on that, and then where it says enter a question for staff, if you just enter your question there, click on send, we'll get the questions and I will have a look through them at the end and ask our panelists the questions. Next slide, please. So I wanted to welcome our two presenters again. We have Professor Michael Regan, or Mike, from I'll go into it in a moment, and we have Nicole Downing. I'll introduce Mike first. So Mike Regan is a Professor of Human Factors with the University of New South Wales Research Centre for Integrated Transport Innovation, or rCITI. Prior to that, he was the Chief Scientist of Human Factors for the Australian Road Research Board, ARB. He has PhD degrees in both psychology and human factors from the Australian National University and more than 20 years experience as a transportation human factors safety researcher in Australia, Europe and the US. Mike's current research interests include driver distraction and inattention, driver interaction with automated vehicles and human factors in road and traffic engineering. He's authored around 250 publications, including 4 books. He's a fellow of the Australasian College of Road Safety and was the 25th president of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Nicole has been the Director of Road and Rail Safety in the Land Transport Safety and Regulation Branch at the Department of Transport and Main Roads, or TMR, in Queensland since 2016. Nicole brought to this role a depth of experience in developing and progressing strategic policy reform across a number of sectors, including the justice system. She's passionate about achieving safety outcomes for communities through the development and implementation of strategic government policy. In TMR, Nicole leads teams of multidisciplinary specialists to develop evidence-based and targeted strategies to effectively respond to road safety challenges in Queensland. Nicole's highly skilled in policy and program development and implementation, in program evaluation, legislation, community engagement, and public governance. So together we have these two who bring with them a wealth of knowledge, expertise, and experience in the area. And we're very grateful to them for agreeing to speak with us today. Thanks to you both. As members of the audience, don't forget to shoot me any questions you have as they deliver their presentations. And I'm going to hand over to Mike with the next slide, please, Isabella. And then after the next slide, onto his slides, please. Thank you. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Adam. Can someone hear me? Anyone?
Yes, we can hear you. Sorry, I just put myself on mute. Yes, we can hear you beautifully. Thanks, Mike.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anna. And welcome, everyone. And thanks for coming along. Next slide, please. I've got quite a few things to talk about today, but as someone who lectures, I'll get through them fairly quickly. And I should go for about 25 minutes or so. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. As Anna kindly said, I've written quite a few things, including a couple of books on driver distraction that you can see there on the top left and the top right, and I'll be referring to some of that work today. And the book on the bottom right has a chapter that talks about the future of distraction in an automated driving world, and I co-wrote that chapter. So I'll be referring to some of that work as well. Next slide, please. I've been working in this area for quite some time, as some of you would know, for probably 15 years on driver distraction and inattention. And one of the things that I am quite proud of is the biannual international conference on driver distraction and inattention, which couldn't occur this year, but will occur next year in Lyon in France in October, probably a hybrid conference in a COVID world. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Next slide, please, Isabella. And there are a few other things I've been involved in as well. Next slide, please. Some of the material I'll be presenting today derives from a couple of book chapters that are in press that I've recently written with a colleague from CARS-Q, Dr. Oscar Oviedo Vespalakios. And so thank you, Oscar, for your contribution. And I just wanted to acknowledge him because I'll be talking a bit about some of the stuff in these chapters. Next slide, please. Next one, please. Driving, as you can see on the slide, and as most of you would know, is quite a complicated task. It involves several activities, and performance of any of those activities or functions can be affected by distraction, even though the research tends to concentrate more on distraction and collision avoidance. Next slide, please. There are many different definitions of driver distraction in the literature, and that really is problematic. because that inconsistency can lead to all sorts of problems in that the comparison of research findings across studies can be difficult or impossible. Different definitions can lead to different classification schemes for coding crash data. And as a consequence, it can result in different estimates of the role of distraction in crashes and critical incidents. Next slide, please. I was a member of a number of expert groups on distraction and inattention over the years, and at one of them about a decade ago, we coined this definition at the top, which is almost identical, as you can see, to one that a friend and colleague of mine, Christy Young, who co-wrote one of those books, coined in our book, along with Professor John Lee. And that's now a very highly cited definition in the literature, and one that I'll be referring to during this course. No, not to taught too many courses, I'm sorry, during this webinar. Next slide, please. I wanted to just start out by saying that driver distraction is just one mechanism of driver inattention. And Charlene Hallett, one of my PhD students, and Craig Gordon, when I was working in France, developed a model and taxonomy of driver inattention, in which we defined inattention as sufficient or no attention to activities critical for safe driving. And in that taxonomy and model, we proposed that driver inattentions induced by 5 mechanisms, only one of which we labelled as distraction. We call it driver diverted attention. Next slide, please. And so this is the model, that's the paper. You can take your time to look through it. And there are many mechanisms that we derive from crash studies and other sources to develop the model. And driver distraction or driver diverted attention in our model involves activities that can be driving related that can distract you, or things that are non-driving related that can distract you. And some of those activities can involve internal thought. So as far as we're concerned, things you think about can distract you, as well as things that you can physically interact with, see, hear, and so on. Next slide, please. There are many different sources of distraction. In one of the papers, one of the book chapters I wrote with Charlene Hallett, we distilled a generic category of sources of distraction from a wide number of crash studies and naturalistic driving studies. And they're only going to be distracting, these things, if drivers engage with them, of course. Next slide, please. One of the things that we find consistently is that about 30% of distraction-related crashes derive from drivers engaging with sources of distraction outside the vehicle. So most of it's going on inside the vehicle. And outside the vehicle, when you analyse crash studies and naturalistic driving data, these are the sorts of things out there that can distract you. And so that gives us a sense for the sorts of countermeasures that we might put in place to deal with those external to the vehicle distractions. I have to say most of the work that's been done so far in this area, though, has really focused more on internal distractions, internal to the vehicle. Next slide, please. A source of distraction, whether it be a mobile phone conversation or an advertising billboard, has certain modal properties that can trigger a diversion of attention away from driving or activities critical for safe driving. So things we see can be distracting, things we hear, things we feel, things we smell. If we smell engine fumes, that's distracting, we think about it. A rotten apple if we're eating, or something that's distasteful can distract us, we think about it. We look at it, for example, to see what's wrong with it, why it's rotten, where it's rotten. And even internal things, as I said before, can distract people. Next slide, please. And those modal properties of a source of distraction, when we hear them, when we see them, when we think about them, lead to one or more what I've called triggered responses. And those triggered responses in a driving context include taking your eyes off the road, which people often call visual distraction, taking your mind off the road, which people often call cognitive distraction, taking your ears off the road, which can arise from cognitive distraction, because when you're thinking about things, you often can't hear things. And when you're interacting, for example, with a handheld mobile phone, that can take one of your hands off the steering wheel. And we refer to that as physical interference. And so even though the number of sources of distraction is limitless, the repertoire of these triggered responses is actually quite finite, which helps us to understand better the mechanisms of distraction. Next slide, please. The degree to which distraction impacts on driving or activities critical for safe driving depends on a few factors. Christy Young, John Lee and I came up with this taxonomy a while ago. You can have two people who are exposed to the same source of distraction, but it could influence them differently depending on their driver characteristics, driving task demand, competing task demand, and the driver's ability to self-regulate in anticipation of a source of distraction or as a result of a source of distraction will also influence the extent to which that source of distraction will impact driving performance. Next slide, please. And if you have access to our book in chapter 19, that's the first book that I wrote with Christy and John, this is the model that we mapped out to explain in a bit more detail what those moderating factors are that influence whether or not a source of distraction has a massive effect on driving performance and crash risk or not. So I won't go into that at the moment. Next slide, please. So if a driver is distracted, performance of the competing task, it might be talking on a mobile phone perhaps, will interfere in some way with driving or activities critical for safe driving. And the type of interference generated depends on the triggered responses I talked about, generated by that competing activity, whether people take their eyes off the road, their mind off the road, ears off the road, or we get physical interference. And each of these triggered responses by itself or in combination will have an impact on driving or activities critical for safe driving. Next slide, please. And the four moderating factors that I just talked about will further determine the amount of interference between the competing task and safe driving. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the effects of distraction now on driving performance. Next slide, please. Now that you understand the mechanisms, when we take our mind off the road, there are lots of things that go on. And we get all sorts of effects, and I don't want to go through all of these effects, but one important one is gaze concentration. So when we're talking on a mobile phone, for example, and particularly if it's a difficult phone conversation that takes a lot of cognitive activity, we tend to look straight ahead more, and we tend to lose our peripheral vision. And as a consequence, we neglect to check our peripheral field of view for rear view mirrors, speedometers, and hazards. And one of the other things that's sort of quite characteristic of taking our mind off the road is that it induces what we call inattention blindness. So when we're thinking about things and our mind is off the road and our mind's in la-la land, it can often be the case that, for example, a pedestrian could walk from behind a parked car. We can prove on it with an eye tracker that you look at him or her, but you don't respond. Or if you do, you respond late. And when our mind's off the road, we tend not to remember much of what we've seen. And you can probably remember the last time you were daydreaming. You might have forgotten at least half of what you saw while you were traveling. Next slide, please. In terms of driving performance, I don't want to go through all of these, but the key point here is that of all of the studies that have been done in driving simulators on test tracks and generally in closed environments and in some naturalistic driving studies where we can get information through video on driving performance and through other sensors, these are the sorts of driving performance effects that we get. And probably the only aspect of driving performance that tends to improve is lane keeping. I don't generally tell too many people that, but we do find through the gaze concentration effect, and there have been many studies confirming it now, that lane keeping improves, but the flip side is that we lose peripheral vision. And so that's a problem. Next slide, please. And these are just a few of the other things that we find from many studies that occur when people take their mind off the road. Next slide, please. When we take our eyes off the road, we get some similar effects, but some different effects. So when the eyes are off the road, you tend to miss signals. And this time you get a gaze concentration effect, but it's of a different kind. We find that when people return their eyes to the road after looking away for, especially for more than a couple of seconds, that it takes people a while to regain their situational awareness, and their field of view is very focused, just like that gaze concentration effect you get by having your mind off the road. And it can sometimes take 20 seconds or so for people to sort of regroup when they get their eyes back on the road and know what's happening. We also find that response time increases, and change blindness is one of the insidious side effects of having your eyes off the road, because when your eyes are off the road, you can often fail to detect changes in the road scene that you rely on to anticipate what might be happening next. And then as for taking your mind off the road, there are some quite characteristic ways in which driving performance is affected there, as you can see on the slide. Thank you, Isabella, for the next slide. And in terms of physical interference, I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure I've ever seen a study that's looked at a controlled way and understanding what the effect is of taking your hand off the wheel and even feet off vehicle controls when you're distracted. So that's an important area for further research. Next slide, please. I'll now talk briefly about distraction and crashes. Next slide, please. Here in Australia, there was an excellent study carried out by Vanessa Beanland and her colleagues some years ago, an in-depth study of some crashes, nearly 900 injury crashes, which were distraction related. And what they found was that about 16% of them were distraction related, mostly involving in-vehicle distractions, which follows from what I said before. In the US, around 8% of fatal crashes consistently involve distraction, and in Norway, around 8% of fatal crashes as well. They were relying on police-reported data, whereas the study in Australia was relying on an in-depth analysis of data. So I think that's telling us that there's a problem out there. Next slide, please. The interesting thing about crashes, and now that you understand more about the mechanisms, is that rear-end crashes and single vehicle run-off road crashes are the two most common types of crashes. Rear-end crashes probably more so due to inattentional blindness when the mind's off the road, and probably a bit of visual distraction, and run-off road crashes more likely due to visual distraction. And you can see that distraction has been estimated to account for anywhere between 21 and 24% of crashes, and might be the cause of around 13% of single vehicle run-off road crashes. Next slide, please. And when it comes to driver distraction and crash risk, next slide, please. There was a huge naturalistic driving study involving 3,500 drivers some time back, just a few years ago, where millions of miles of continuous data were collected. People had video cameras and sensors in their vehicles for up to 2 years. And in this study, an analysis was done of the 905 injury and property damage crashes that occurred. Next slide, please. And what they found, what Tom Dingus and his colleagues found, was that for half the time people were distracted, and that for almost 70% of the crashes, distraction or observable distraction was a contributing factor. So that's much higher than police and medical reported data would suggest. And overall, distraction increased the odds of having a crash by a factor of 2. Next slide, please. As you can see, if you look at that data in more detail, dialing a handheld phone, for example, increased risk and had an odds ratio of 12.2, so it increased the risk of having a crash by 12.2 times, and for 1.14% of people's time, they were engaging in that activity, which is the baseline prevalence. And generally you find that the activities that have the highest odds ratios are the ones that involve people having their eyes off the road and taking a hand off the wheel generally, and generally to hold an object or manipulate an object. Next slide, please. This is one of the few studies in which they found that talking on a handheld cell phone increased crash risk by 2.2 times, and most of the time, and you can see how that compares with the increase in crash risk for other activities. If we go to the next slide, please. If you compare distraction at the very bottom with other activities, you can see that the increase in crash risk overall is a bit less than some of the other sort of top 5 risky driving behaviours that we tackle in road safety. But you can see that the baseline prevalence in that study was very high. So this is data again from the same study. So it might not be as risky, but people engage in it much more regularly. Next slide, please. This slide simply shows that most of the studies that have been done to date, most of them using naturalistic driving data, show that conversing on a handheld or hands-free phone generally doesn't increase crash risk. Next slide, please, except for that one study I reported. And that really puzzled me. And so in this particular study, which we published a couple of years ago, we tried to understand why that's so. And I won't have time to talk about that, but could talk about that offline for anyone who's interested. And if you're interested, you can have a look at that article. Next slide, please. So as for prevention and management strategies, I've got 6 minutes to get through the rest of my slides. Next slide, please. In one of the book chapters that Oscar and I wrote recently for the Vision Zero Handbook, these are the general prevention and management strategies that are available, particularly for road authorities to manage the problem. And I'm sure that Nicole's going to talk about some of these. In the book chapter, we go into obviously more detail into each of these dot points. And so I think the point I'd like to make is there's lots we can do about it. Next slide, please. But the issue is what actually works. And so what Oscar and I did in that book chapter was to review the literature to find out what we know about what actually works. So next slide, please. So there are quite a few countermeasures that have been developed around the world. Unfortunately, very few have been evaluated, which I think is a big problem in the distraction space. And I'll mention a few countermeasures that appear to work to some extent in the remaining slides. And next slide, please. One exception is fully automated vehicles that can drive themselves completely in all conditions. We don't have research to prove that they will work, but I think it's probably a bit of a no-brainer at this stage to say that when there's no steering wheel in the vehicle and you're just an occupant, you won't be distracted from driving. You may be distracted from other things that you might need to attend to in those vehicles, but until we know exactly how they operate, we don't know what they will have to pay attention to as occupants. But we won't have these vehicles around based on most projections for quite some years. So distraction will be with us for some time. Next slide, please. Of course, advanced driver assistance systems that we have in modern vehicles, in Society of Automotive Engineers, level 1 and 2 vehicles, which are out on our roads now, have huge safety benefits. And there may be some of you listening who've done the research to prove that, and I've proven it in some of my research. But the problem is that some of them may be poorly designed, the human-machine interfaces may be poorly designed, and there is evidence that some aren't, and that some of these warnings and alarms that they issue can be distracting. But overall, the safety benefits will outweigh the negativities, I would say. Next slide, please. Workload managers are a technology in some production vehicles that prevent driver interaction with sources of distraction in high workload conditions, because sensors in the vehicle can detect when people are in high workload conditions. They've been proven to be effective to some extent in regulating interactions with driver assistance systems. We don't yet know whether they're effective from research in managing non-driving related information or sources of distraction that drivers deal with. Next slide, please.
Mike, you have about 5 minutes left. You asked me for a reminder.
Thank you, Anna. Of course, where things like seatbelts and vehicle design structurally, passive safety features and emergency care are concerned, these are all factors if someone has a distraction-related crash that have been proven to reduce the severity of crashes. Next slide, please. In terms of road design, the PIARC, the World Road Association, in one of its documents recommends a range of road engineering treatments to mitigate the effects of driver distraction. And they're the sorts of things we see there that have been proven to reduce energy exchange in crashes, to, as a result, make people less injured, to reduce speed so that impact collisions are lower, and with rumble strips and rough shoulders to remind people that they're driving off the road if they're visually distracted, to enable them to get themselves back onto the road. So these are proven design features that will help mitigate the effect of distraction. Next slide, please. There is blocking technology out there, including mobile phone apps and hardware designed to block mobile phone use while driving. And that's been found in some studies to be effective in reducing mobile phone use while driving. But as you can see from the slide, acceptance tends to be low among drivers, particularly younger drivers. So we need to think again about the human and how we can design those technologies to be more acceptable to people. Next slide, please. There are also some feedback systems that have been developed where people are driving, and if they glance away from the roadway for a long period of time, the system will actually give them feedback in real time. And there are other feedback systems in which people can be given feedback after the drive to help them calibrate their glance behaviours. And we find that these are quite effective ways of minimising long eye glances away from the road. Next slide, please. Mobile phone bans are popular around the world. Many bans, but very few bans have been evaluated, and there are mixed reports about the effectiveness of bans. I'm not even sure I've seen an evaluation of mobile phone bans here in Australia, but what we tend to find is that they reduce handheld mobile phone use in some jurisdictions, but for a short period of time, unless there's a lot of enforcement. They're generally not very effective in reducing texting behaviour. And there's little or no long-term effect on the prevalence of mobile phone use among novice drivers. So legislation doesn't seem to be that effective for younger drivers. Next slide, please. Only got about 4 to go, I think. In terms of police enforcement, studies demonstrate that handheld mobile phone use bans require robust police enforcement to have long-term effects. So police enforcement is very important, but police officers are unable to sometimes correctly enforce legislation in many circumstances due to the reasons that you can see there on the slide. Next slide, please. Employers have a big role to play because people spend a lot of time driving for work purposes, and there's certainly evidence that truck and bus drivers, at least working for organisations that enforce texting bans, have lower texting and driving prevalence compared to companies without bans. Next slide, please. This is an excellent document. If you haven't seen it, you can find it on the internet. I was involved in developing it with the NRSPP, and I'm sure that if that policy was implemented and evaluated, you'd find that it would improve, prevent distraction and to help mitigate its effects significantly. Next slide, please.
And Mike, you're running very close to time. Maybe just a minute or two more to wrap up.
No worries, I'll be finished in 1 minute. Thank you, Anna. There are some educational programs that have been found to be at least to some extent effective in improving people's driving behaviour where distraction is concerned. You can find those on the internet. Next slide, please. There is a training program that has been found to be effective called Focal. And again, if you look up Focal on the internet and put distraction, you'll find some information about that. So training can be effective in this space. Next slide, please. And I suppose just to finish off in terms of the future, there's really no evidence that partially automated vehicles can reduce distraction. In fact, the evidence at the moment is that vehicles that are partially automated actually tend to increase distraction. Next slide, please. And that can be due to people engaging in distracting activities while using autopilots, for example, in Teslas. It can be unexpected actions and alerts that can create what we call automation surprises if people don't understand how these systems work. And there's a lot of evidence now that the ability to take back control in vehicles equipped with automated driving features, if they can't, for some reason, continue to operate, is impaired when drivers are distracted. Next slide, please. And who knows, it might even be that in future, if autonomous vehicles driving themselves drive in a way that drivers think erratic, that they will be distracting for drivers driving manual vehicles. Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, this is the last slide. Distraction is only one mechanism of driver inattention, as I've explained. There's plenty of evidence that it's a road safety problem. Automated vehicles will create some new distraction issues that need to be characterised and understood. And I think the most important thing I'd like to convey is that countermeasures to distraction really need to be derived from the best available and reliable scientific knowledge of the underlying mechanisms of distraction, and I've tried to explain those today, and based on the prevalence of different distracting activities and the risks associated with those activities, which I've also talked about today. Next slide, please. And thank you very much. And if you'd like any more information, then please feel free to contact me. And sorry for going a minute or two over time. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for providing us with such a wealth of information about this complex area of driver inattention and distraction. Isabella, can we transfer back to the other slide deck, please, on slide 8? Next slide, please. And over to you, Nicole. So if we go to the next slide, Nicole can start her presentation.
Thanks, Anna, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here and talk about the work that we've been doing in Queensland. Can we go to the next slide, please? So many of you will probably be aware that about 3 years ago, Queensland embarked on a journey to better understand driver distraction from mobile devices. We undertook a number of pieces of work that has ultimately led to the National Roadmap to address driver distraction, which has now been endorsed by all transport ministers and placed on their program of work. So today what I'll do is talk through the process we applied in this work, and I'll finish by touching on a few of the projects Queensland's now progressing. So we applied two methodologies, in fact, throughout the work. The first is the use of human-centered design approach, and the second was applying a systems approach in identifying and developing the solutions. These have been applied throughout the stages of the project, which I'll now talk through in each of these stages, 1 through 3. Next slide, please. And we'll skip this one into the next one. So stage 1 of the project, we found that driver distraction related fatalities are increasing. While this is based on Queensland data, it appears to be representative of what's been happening across the country. And we also found that distraction from devices is contributing to about 1/5 of hospitalisations as well. It is agreed generally that there's widespread underreporting of distraction crashes, particularly with the use of mobile phones. And while most admit it's a problem, not everyone still pretty much does it. So in terms of taking a human-centered approach, we undertook a fair amount of market research to learn why and how people use their devices while driving. So 70% of drivers said they use their phone illegally, at least occasionally, with about 1/3 of those using it illegally on most trips. This seems to be similar to what we've seen around the country and around the world. And we also found that that it's showing an increase in high frequency use of an increase of 11% over the last half dozen years. Not only is the overall use increasing, but the depth is changing as well. So visual distractions and how they're using their phones are changing, and that makes sense when we think about how phones have evolved over the last sort of 6-7 years. Drivers now use their phones on average 3 different ways. So reading a text while driving, using a speakerphone, and changing music and sending texts. When we asked people why they use their phones illegally, they told us a range of things. The most common one was to stay in touch. They also felt a pressure to respond. You'll see on the screen there that's the percentages down the right-hand side of the proportion of people saying these were the reasons. Concerningly, a fifth of people said it's just a habit. Also there you've got work expects them to. They feel bored, they need to feel connected, they don't think that they'll get caught. And often that these aren't isolated, these reasons are coming together in a couple at a time. So overall what we will find is that people are systematically downplaying the risk of using their phone while driving and increasing the benefit or the outcome. So what we know that despite that commonly held view of underreporting and crash data, the data we have still shows that distraction is a serious fatal 5 contributor to road trauma, and one of the 2 fatal 5 contributors on the rise, the other one being drunk driving. So the distraction project set out to find ways to reduce the number of drivers that continue to use their phones illegally. And if we can go to the next slide, please, we moved into stage 2. So with knowing the problem and knowing the influence on the ecosystem on a driver's decision to use their phone, we went into stage 2. And stage 2 aimed to identify a range of solutions through 4 separate yet interrelated streams of work, working with the ecosystem, looking at regulatory options, technological solutions, and channel responsibility provisions. So stream 1 is working with the ecosystem. I'll say straight up is the ecosystem was found to include industry stakeholders such as telecommunication companies, vehicle manufacturers, device manufacturers, insurance providers, fleet managers, regulators, enforcers, academia, and peak industry bodies, as well as the driver themselves at the centre of the ecosystem. And really that ecosystem said that while the driver was still ultimately responsible, all of those factors were influencing their decision to use a phone, whether it was conscious decision or not. So through stream 1, we connected with all elements of the ecosystem. We undertook over 80 one-on-one individual stakeholder engagements as in forms of interviews. That led into 5 targeted innovation workshops and ultimately led to the National Summit on Driver Distraction, which I will get to shortly. The second stream was a Queensland specific stream, and we did a review of our penalty regime. We evaluated the effectiveness of the existing regime and the various regulatory functions. We also, as part of that, undertook specific stakeholder engagement with enforcement and regulatory experts. And we also considered the application of the emerging technology. And the key outcome many of you will know from that stream 2 is in Queensland, we've increased our fine to $1,000 and increased amount points and in February of this year. So stage 3 was slightly separate to the others and has informed some subsequent pieces of work, which I'll get to shortly. But what we looked at in stage 3 is what technology could support and assist future solutions. So we developed a problem statement and we invited the market to make submissions on the technology solutions or technology innovations that they were working on. And we did this in late 2018. So we identified 4 categories. First was software, then hybrid, sensory, and then enforcement type solutions. We invited 11 shortlisted vendors to pitch 17 different solutions in across 5 discovery days to us. And we used that as a stepping stone to some future pieces of work, which I'll get to in the next slide. In the 4th stream of work on this slide, we investigated the application of chain of responsibility principles for non-heavy vehicles, as well as for manufacturers of vehicles and mobile devices. So we investigated these principles in relation to the design and functionality of products and services. We wanted to identify opportunities to encourage better integration of distraction mitigation technologies and safer user interfaces. And we wanted to identify if there's good practice examples among fleet management of driver distraction. So in the Australian context, chain of responsibility principles are enforced in the heavy vehicle national law, which is in place in Queensland and other participating jurisdictions. And those principles were amended on the 1st of October 2018 to align with workplace health and safety principles. So we wanted to investigate their relevance, irrespective of whether someone was driving for work as part of a heavy vehicle fleet, a light vehicle fleet, or the growing grey fleet, which is where individuals drive their own personal vehicle for work purposes. And we also investigated, we investigated this application through Stream 1 and the engagement of the stakeholders through the industry representation. So if we move to the next slide, please. We took all of Stream 2 and we brought it together into a national workshop on driver distraction, which was held in the middle of 2019 in Brisbane. The summit was co-delivered between TMR and the Office for Road Safety, and it brought together all of those industry ecosystem members that I mentioned: the vehicle manufacturers, device manufacturers, insurance providers, telecommunication companies, infrastructure planners, academic researchers, regulators and enforcement agencies from around the country, including many of multinational organisations. So these stakeholders discussed and refined the solutions that had come through in stage 2 by taking part in interactive dialogue along 5 key strategy areas. So the first area is designing for a safer interaction between vehicles and devices. The second one was mapping out the adoption of in-vehicle distraction mitigation technology. The third was recognising vehicles as a workplace. The next was how we can encourage greater compliance through enforcement, and the last one was how to change driver behaviour. So over 50 initiatives were categorised under these 5 strategies and programs following the 2 days at the summit. We did further refinement and further engagement across the whole of the ecosystem before we took the roadmap to the Transport and Infrastructure Council, now known as the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers Meeting. And in June this year, they endorsed the roadmap for its inclusion on the Forward Work Programme, and that provides us a really good stepping stone to start to implement or further develop countermeasures, as Mike mentioned before. Many of the countermeasures that Mike was talking about before have been identified through this program of work and are within those 50 initiatives. Some would be the requirement of industry to progress and implement, and government will have a role in that, and other would be governments lead to do that. So if we step to the next stage, next slide. What I'll just touch on now before finishing up is some of the solutions that we're progressing in Queensland based on the findings from the work that we've done over the last couple of years. So as I mentioned, we've already increased our penalties for the fine to $1,000 and demerit points to 4, and double demerit points on the second offence within 12 months. What that actually means in reality is for our typical open licence holder with no previous traffic history, they'll face a loss of licence if they're caught with 2 offences within a 12-month period. For learner licence holders and provisional licence holders, they lose their licence on the first offence. The research that we did indicated this increase is perceived severity would improve general deterrence effect, essentially. We also have received, we went to the community with it before we introduced it 6 months in consultation, and there's strong community support both before and after its introduction of the significantly increased fine. So that's been good to see. The next one that we, along with Victoria, in trial stage and New South Wales has already rolled out, where we're looking to trial the camera technology, similar to what's in New South Wales, to increase the perception of certainty of detecting drivers committing a mobile phone offence. As Mike and our own research has pointed out, people don't expect to be caught. Also in this, and we've also incorporated identifying people in the front seats of vehicles not wearing their seat belts. So that the trial that's currently underway and will conclude at the end of this year is both testing technology for camera, mobile phone detection and non-seat belt wearing detection. And we'll roll that out most likely during 2021. In addition to developing effective enforcement tools, we're also looking or seeking to combine a technological approach with behavioural economics by seeing whether there's technology which can nudge drivers towards compliance by offering real-time alerts. So what we're looking to run into early in the new year is a proof of concept similar to our speed awareness monitors, and whether that we've got the technology is advanced enough to be able to do similar to that with mobile phone use, and just nudge the drivers to stop using it. Another project that we've got underway relates to data, and we have data was consistently raised throughout the project by all the stakeholders as a major factor and influencer that needed to be better understood and utilised. So we've just commenced an exercise to determine the opportunities and barriers around accessing and using current and potential data sets to support and enhance road crash knowledge caused by driver distraction, and to put TMO in a position to determine feasibility of developing a data platform to enable the investigation, tracking and sharing of crash and infringement data resulting from driver distraction. Similarly, we're also investigating the impact of financial and non-financial penalties and benefits on corporate fleet insurance policies through incentivising the implementation of safer driving technologies and policies, as well as the viability of personalised insurance pricing for individuals that exhibit safe driving behaviour with an emphasis on distraction mitigation. Also already discussed is the workplace and vehicles as a workplace. So a piece of work we've commenced targeting high-risk sectors to link workplace health and safety with road safety. We know that vehicles, 32% of worker fatalities are caused on road. That's coming from workplace health and safety data. So we've just commenced a piece of work to examine how we can effectively support development and sharing best practice industry guidelines for organisations encompassing policies and practices for driver distraction mitigation, as well as other road safety issues. This piece of work in particular, while we'll have a focus on driver distractions, particularly mobiles, but we will support organisations to take a much broader risk management approach in their fleet management activities. And we'll be able to update you on some of this into the new year as we finalise it. So that's yes, that's all I wanted to talk about. We've got the national roadmap. It's been endorsed at the national level, and
Wonderful.
we've got our own. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Next slide, please, Isabel, and we'll see Nicole's contact details there. Thanks to both you, Nick and Mike, for a great presentation, so informative and quite different perspectives on this whole thing, issue of inattention and distraction for drivers. So great to see that. We had quite a few questions come through, and you know, we've gone over a little bit of time, but we will get through as many of them as quickly as we possibly can. So the first one I have is, gets directed really at you, Mike. What about overstimulation? Can we measure it from a distraction perspective? Too much signage, multiple lights, crossings in heavily congested areas? And I'll get you to just keep the answers fairly short so we can get through as many of the questions as possible. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, you know, traffic engineers basically set out not to distract drivers. Advertising agencies generally do set out to distract drivers and capture their attention for obvious reasons. In terms of measuring overstimulation, that's an interesting one. When I was working for UB, in fact, we did a piece of research where we used a computer algorithm that was able to extract from photos of different environments around Sydney just how cluttered the environments were. And on a scale of sort of 1 to 10, the algorithm was able to give us a clutter score. And often the clutter was very much due to excessive use of signage. So even though traffic engineers, I think, do their best to follow the rules and guidelines and minimise distraction on our roads, there are some situations where a combination of too much signage and other attributes of the built environment can overstimulate people for sure and distract them. And so you know, we need to make sure that we adhere to the relevant guidelines and standards to minimise distraction, and especially from advertising signage. And the Austroads guide that Paul Roberts and his colleagues developed some years ago on minimising distraction from advertising signage is an excellent document, I think, that all people should be aware of in this space. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I think you answered one of our other questions during that too. Another question for you, Mike. Cars are increasingly incorporating distracting activities into the vehicle's controls or dashboards. For instance, you can change your iPod music using your vehicle's controls. Is this a risky strategy for those manufacturers, or is it an improvement?
Well, the guy who's been doing all the research on that topic is a guy called Professor David Strayer at the University of Utah. So for anyone who wants more information about that, they can Google David Strayer, Uni Utah distraction in vehicle devices, and you can find all the latest information about that. Generally the situation is that if these devices can have the effect of reducing visual distraction in particular, and allowing the interactions that do occur to be more cognitive interactions where you're speaking to the device and you're listening to things, then you find they will have the effect of reducing distraction. One of the problems with these sorts of devices, though, if they're not you know, properly human engineered, is that you can have a situation where you can have the connectivity, but in doing so, when you're wanting to hear music or wanting to see things that it's legal to hear and that are legal to hear and see within the vehicle, if the human machine interface for the vehicle itself is badly designed, if it's a badly designed touchscreen, then this interactivity with your phone can actually increase distraction. So a lot of it's, so I think the idea of, you know, these Bluetooth, you know, connectivity devices, Apple CarPlay and that sort of thing is good, but it depends on how well they're human engineered, and it depends on how well the vehicle in which the phone is connected to has been designed. And You know, if the Australian Automobile Association is on the line, they'll know that they funded me and my colleagues to do some research and studied Vic roads. Actually, when I was at Arb a while ago, to develop a test protocol, in fact, to test the distractibility of the human-machine interface in modern vehicles, to see whether displays, warnings, and other interactions are distracting. And that would include testing these devices like Apple CarPlay, for example. And the idea would be that if through the test protocol we gave a car a high rating, that means that that would be a car that is very distracting, and it wouldn't do well in NCAP testing if the protocol were introduced into NCAP. And it follows very much from exactly what Nicole was saying. It's you know, human-centered design of technology is very important. And in that list of strategies I talked about, we did, and in that book chapter, in fact, we did refer to Nicole's excellent work in Queensland. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Now, it's now 1:31, and we have the choice to end the seminar now, and I'm sure there are some people on the webinar who will need to move along. Isabella, can I just get you to flick forward 2 slides? But I wanted to offer the opportunity. There are just very few more questions. Nicole and Mike, if you would like to stay on, we could record the answers to these questions, and anyone who wanted to join us for that could continue to listen in. But it depends on whether you both have things you have to go and join, and the same for you, Isabella, if you have a meeting you have to go and join.
I'm actually okay, Anna. I can stay as long as you like.
Okay,
Yeah,
Nicole?
I can stay for a little while as well.
And how about you, Isabella?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Anna, what I'd recommend is just answer a few more questions, as we'll be recording this presentation. And then once you've answered the few more questions, I'll turn the presentation off.
Wonderful. Thank you, all of you. So anyone who can't continue to join us, thanks so much for joining us. We will try and answer these questions fairly quickly so that those of you who want to stay on with us can get back to your other work as well. So I've got a couple of questions for Nicole. One is, how much of an issue is distraction for other road users? So this question is more about the vulnerable road users, pedestrians, bicyclists. Over to you, Nicole.
Thanks. I don't have with me data to quantify how much of an issue it is, but through our focus groups and individual meetings with vulnerable road user groups and individuals, more and more, particularly for bike riders, cyclists, it becomes an issue both for themselves using it on their bike, but also for car drivers when they're in traffic. So I think, particularly in slower traffic, the stop-start traffic, that's where feedback we got was saying that they feel most at risk when people are going slow in their cars, but their head's down looking at the phone rather than at the bike rider next to them. But I don't have quantified data with me. I can follow that up. I'm not sure how much we've got on it.
Okay, thanks so much. And then here's another tricky question along the same kind of lines, Nicole. Is there significant differences between distraction in urban and rural areas?
That's a tough one. What we did find through stage 1 was there's a myth that younger people use their phones more than older people. We tended to dispel that myth, but in dispelling the myth, what we found was that younger people use their phones much differently to older drivers. And by the way, older drivers would text or take a phone call. Younger drivers were much more engaged with social media. We tended to find people were using their phones more on lower speed urban roads, but then through our camera trial, we're finding that there's a lot of people using it on high speed roads. In terms of the regional and rural or urban separation, I think the main difference is who's using it rather than on what road network they're using it. People tend to make judgments. They do tend to self-regulate, with older people tending to self-regulate and use it at lights more regularly or more often than younger people. But we didn't find any discernible differences in terms of the amount of usage.
Okay, thanks. It's very interesting to hear that there's not so many differences between the younger and the older groups. Okay, so we've got one that I haven't read, but I'll just read it now. It's for Mike. Vehicle speed is an important factor in driver reaction time, particularly if drivers are inattentive from a range of distractions. Do you know of any research around speeding and distracted driving? Over to you, Mike.
I think that's a very good question, and I think the answer's not straightforward. What I would, and the interfaces that I'm thinking about are quite complex. But what we do know is when people speed up, the field of view narrows. It's like a gaze concentration effect. So it's a bit like I talked about before. When you're cognitively distracted, there's this gaze concentration effect. And as you speed up when you're driving, you get a gaze concentration effect as well. What I suspect is, what I hypothesize is, without knowing what the literature says, is that probably the faster we go, especially in an urban environment, the more likely we are to self-regulate, in the sense that we're probably more likely to not allow ourselves to be distracted by things that we might otherwise look at least to the extent that we have some voluntary control over what we pay attention to. So I'd probably say that the slower people go, the more likely they are to allow themselves to be distracted, if it's voluntary distraction, and the faster we go, the less likely it is, I'd say, that we would distract ourselves. It's a survival mechanism. It's a self-regulatory mechanism. Of course, if you're on a highway and you're travelling at high speed and there's nothing to do, and there's not much you have to pay attention to, then that's probably an exception. So I think that's my fundamental answer to the question.
Lovely. Nicole, did you have anything to add to Mike's answer there?
I'd probably just reiterate that that's what we found as well through the self-regulation conversation that we had with people.
Yeah. Okay. I guess there's sort of 2 or 3 more questions. One is one is an issue that I've actually suggested before to Nick and to a few others, which is, it's a suggestion from someone for a campaign using the song by the Doors. I haven't mentioned the song by the Doors, but the song by the Doors includes the words, "Keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel." So it's more a suggestion than a question.
Yeah. Do you want me to respond to that at all?
If you'd like to.
Look, campaigns are great, and I know in Queensland as well as in other jurisdictions, we do really take targeted focus groups on the campaigns of what will work, what to different target audiences. We've also got, at least in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, we work with REACT organisation with university students, and this year's work with them was around driver distraction as well. So there's a lot of campaign work out there. We can never have too much, and I guess just finding what hits the right market at the right time, and what, particularly for us government people, what we're allowed to get through is always a challenge.
Yeah, hitting the market is crucial in that game, isn't it? Someone else says that song also includes words along the lines of "I woke up in the morning and I got myself a beer." There are 2 more questions. So one is actually my question, which is, I've now done been convening these 2 seminars, which have been so interesting on seminal work that's been done in driver distraction. And I noticed that there's been no mentions of the 100-car study and the 2 seconds eyes off the forward roadway finding of increased crash risk related to that. I noticed that in one of your slides, Mike, you talked about the focal training program and there was a mention of 2 seconds in relation to that. Did either of you have anything to comment on in terms of that finding?
Well, it's Mike here. Look, all I can say is it's a ubiquitous finding. There have been many studies actually that have found that the risk of having a crash, whether it's a property damage crash, an injury crash, or a fatal crash, increases if you take your eyes off the road for more than a couple of seconds. And then beyond that, it's a bit of an exponential increase in risk. I think people are just not studying that phenomenon anymore, generally, because they know that that's the issue. The interesting issue is, what they are otherwise doing, during that 2-second period. And if they're retaining in memory, as best they can, situational awareness of where they were just before they glanced away, and retain in working memory as best they can what's going on during that 2-second period, they've got a better chance of reorienting themselves and minimising the effect of that gaze concentration effect that occurs when you put your eyes back on the road. So I think at the moment the line of research is focused not so much on confirming that 2-second finding, but more about understanding the mechanisms by which performance is degraded during that 2 seconds, and how you could support the driver in regaining situational awareness and control of the vehicle when their eyes are back on the road, when that gaze concentration effect kicks in.
It's interesting, those modifying factors, and how important they are.
Yeah, I might just add, sorry, Anna, I might just add just very quickly to that is when we did our work, we absolutely, through our lit review, had all of that information, and there's so much depth and wealth of information out there. We didn't want to re-prosecute that. We accepted that and then worked forward to what to do with it to influence driver behaviour.
Yeah, it is a very thorough study, that one. Yeah. Okay, so we have another one, and there's another one that's come through, which I'll read in a moment. This one is actually, and it's kind of nice segue from something you said during your last answer, Mike. This is about inattentional blindness. So something that we haven't touched on in terms of the question so far. It's a question from someone who used to manage level crossing programs for New South Wales Police. And inattentional blindness was considered a reason why a driver would fail to see a train coming in broad daylight. It seemed to be a particular problem for people who lived near railway level crossings or people who were driving for work, such as truck drivers. As Mike alluded to, they looked, but they did not see. And what can road authorities and other road safety practitioners and even the general public, what can we do to address that situation?
I can say a couple of words. Nicole's a practitioner working in rail safety as well, so she's probably better in a practical sense to talk about what we can do. But the colleague who asked the question's quite right. There are actually two inattentional mechanisms going on, I think, at level crossings. If we draw back to that model that I presented earlier, the 5 different mechanisms of inattention, one of them is what we call driver neglected attention. That's very much about expectations. So that means that in the case of a level crossing, especially if it's out in an urban and a rural environment, out in the country, if you approach that level crossing 100 times a month and you never see trains, then you develop the expectation that there are no trains there. And through that expectation effect, you then stop actually actively searching for trains. So that's one mechanism I think that's going on. And then the other mechanism, the inattention blindness in that situation, is probably going to be most likely if the person is cognitively distracted, and not only cognitively distracted, but perhaps immersed in a very cognitively engaging activity. It might be they might be having a difficult discussion with their boss or with a partner or something like that, that actually really not only consumes a lot of cognitive capacity, but is also emotionally arousing. And so it's more likely that inattention blindness, I think, in that situation will occur if there's something particularly cognitively demanding that's taking their attention away from the track. And in terms of how do you deal with railway level crossing problems in rural environments and urban environments, I think Nicole would be the expert on that.
Well, I'm not quite sure I'd say I'm an expert, but I think what we do, and through the level crossing safety committees that we've got in jurisdictions and nationally, and a research board called ACRS, and there's a lot of evidence and research into how we make particularly our passive level crossings more active for those people, particularly those people, as you said, that who use them regularly and don't often see a train coming. There's a lot of research using technology around identifying a vehicle coming and actively targeting that vehicle so that you bring their awareness to the level crossing, and similarly when the train's coming, that there's activation so that anyone driving or walking is notified in different ways than just expecting the driver or the pedestrian to actively look. Some of that's still in research, some of it is being trialled in different rural settings. I know in some urban settings with pedestrians at level crossings, they're using LED lights and some signals for people when they've got their headphones in and looking down. So there's a range of things that I guess are in trial. Anything to do with rail is exorbitantly expensive, and so you tend to trial them a couple of times in different locations before determining how to roll them out more broadly. And they tend to all be currently looking at technology solutions rather than trying to to notify or to bring awareness back to the driver, rather than education or just passive signage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess in that risk hierarchy, wouldn't it be lovely if it weren't quite so expensive and difficult in terms of land management to eliminate those at level rail crossings?
Absolutely, yeah.
That would be our ideal. We have just one last comment, not really a question, and it relates to that discussion we had earlier about speeding and distraction. So this person has said the problem is that drivers do not appreciate the risk of minor speeding. Generally, they think the risk of a serious crash doubles at 20 kilometres over the speed limit, not the 5 kilometre that so much crash research has found. So paying better attention while speeding is unlikely to balance the greatly increased risk of a serious crash. And thank you so much to all of those of you who are still attending, because I can see there are plenty of you, and to all of those of you who ask questions, because looking through those names, there are plenty of you out there who are experts in your own right in this area and other areas of road safety. So thanks so much for joining us. Thanks again, Mike and Nick, for bringing us this wealth of information and for staying online and answering all of those questions. And when that information goes up and the webinar is posted, people can access that and get all that information in one hit. Thanks very much to ARB for supporting us and doing so much promotional material for us. Thanks to Isabella and Jess and Susie from ARB for helping make this day run smoothly. Whoops, sorry. And yeah, thanks to the Australasian College of Road Safety and the New South Wales Committee for enabling us to hold this event. Much appreciated, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.